Thanks for joining us. I'm here with Coleman Hughes, who is a young American student, and he's also a writer and musician. He's written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, National Review, The Spectator. He got his beginning at Quillette, which is the magazine that I edit. And he's flown all the way from New Jersey. Is that right?
New York.
Yeah. All right, so I doubt many people in the audience know who you are, so why don't you tell us who you are and what your family background is and how you got involved with writing.
Well, I was born and raised in New Jersey to a middle-class family. My mother her family came from Puerto Rico, classic immigrant story, moved to the South Bronx in the mid-20th century. My father, his family traces back to slavery in the United States. So I grew up, I was a pretty nerdy, introverted kid. I loved music. Music was basically the plan for me. I still play trombone, piano, drums. I was very into jazz. So out of high school, I went to Juilliard for a semester. And the plan was to be a jazz musician, but I'd also, I'd always been a pretty voracious reader, and I cared about politics and cultural issues as well. So I was writing for nobody for a long time, just for myself. And eventually, my good friend Christian Gonzalez wrote a piece for Quillette. And I saw that he also went to Columbia University, where I had transferred to by this point. And I got the idea to write for Quillette. And pretty much since the first piece, it basically blew up overnight. So I became a writer.
Yeah, and for context, Coleman is the most read columnist on our platform. Out of the top 10 articles we had published last year, he had 6 in the top 10. So his writing is extremely popular and is becoming increasingly well known in the United States. So how would you identify politically today?
That's a good question. So on the topic of race, I suppose I'm seen as a conservative. I don't actually think of myself in terms of conservatism or liberalism or progressivism. I try to take things on a case-by-case basis, but on the topic of race, my views in an American context would clearly put me in the conservative camp, even though many of the things that I emphasize in terms of, for example, viewing class as a more important component of political action as opposed to race. Many of these are also sometimes views expressed by socialists or Marxists. So there's that.
I think in one of your interviews, perhaps with Dave Rubin, you said something like, if you can be gender fluid, I don't see why you can't be politically fluid.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that your stance changes depending on the issue?
Yeah, definitely. I think the mistake people make with politics and with trying to analyze what's going on in a society in general is to apply one model to a system that can't be explained by one model. So people really want society and politics to be like a simple physical model where once you learn Newton's laws, you really explain all of, you can understand with perfect accuracy how a bowling ball is rolling down an alley. Society isn't like that. So if you are a libertarian or a conservative or a progressive and you have one theory of causation, society is far too complicated to be described by that in the way that the laws of physics might neatly describe a bowling ball down an alley. So I challenge myself to be perpetually open to objections from other models of the world.
And would you say that you somewhat cherry pick the best ideas from each intellectual tradition, or at least try to cherry pick?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are very few popular models of the world that are completely wrong in every single causal, theory that they embrace. Even ones that have a track record of failure, like Marxism, for example. It's not everything Marx ever said was wrong. So you have to, I think, even if you're someone like me who on most questions would read perhaps centrist or conservative or, on economics, somewhat libertarian, you have to be open to objections from other models, for sure.
Now, I want to know if there was any event in particular in your life which politicized you.
Like as it is for most people, it was not necessarily one event, but a series of them. But I would, if I had to choose one, it would be the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson in 2014. I don't know how central this story was in Australia, but it absolutely dominated the news in America, and it really launched the Black Lives Matter movement. It was the moment, the central grievance around which that movement was born, is that the cops it was essentially open season on black men from the point of view of police violence. And I remember at this time I had a fairly left-wing view of politics. I was something of a quote-unquote social justice warrior in the sense that I thought it was very important to view social interactions in racial terms, to, for white people to check their privilege and whatnot. The whole suite of beliefs associated with the social justice left was something that I subscribed to. And I remember taking the default view at first of the Michael Brown situation, which was that here was another young, unarmed black man killed by the cops unjustly, and this is essentially Emmett Till all over again. But then I remember I had a roommate at the time who didn't necessarily have the same position, and I just committed to reading the entire testimonial of the cop and of Michael Brown's friend, and I stayed up all night reading this, and I remember coming away with it thinking, oh my God, I actually have no idea what happened here. If the cop is telling the truth, then there's actually nothing he could have done different. And if the friend is telling the truth, then this cop needs to go to jail. But why are people on both sides assuming that they know which one is true? But 5 years after that, multiple witnesses have now come forward and said that the idea that Michael Brown had his hands up and was shot just wasn't true. Okay. Right? So now, if you're a betting person, you should bet that's not what happened. Okay. But I think reevaluate, just being humbled at that moment, knowing that I didn't actually know what was going on, and most people were were trying to signal that they were good people in their local communities rather than actually dealing with the facts. That was an important moment.
So it sounds like you gained epistemological humility at that point, where you realized there was more that you didn't know than what you knew. And has that shaped or colored the way you've approached politics and intellectual topics since then?
Yeah, I think so. There's this blogger, Scott Alexander, I think you're familiar with, who had a great post called Conflict Theory versus Mistake Theory. And the conflict theory is the approach to politics that the problems we're mainly dealing with are, we have bad people out there, and we need to defeat them. And depending on the topic, those bad people might be those who are, and this goes for left and right. For the left, it's the bad people are those who oppose immigration, what have you. For the right, it's people who are pro-immigration, and what we have to do is we have to destroy them politically, right? Yeah. But mistake theorists tend to assume that our primary problem is we're kind of like people sitting over someone who's injured, and we have to figure out how to make this thing work.
Yeah.
And the primary problem is a lack of facts, a lack of understanding. And if we could only talk to each other for long enough and in good faith and agree on our models of the world,
Yeah.
then we would make progress that way. So I think I did shift from, I think implicitly I grew up feeling that politics was about conflict
Yeah.
theory, and I think I've more and more shifted just, largely because I've realized how many of my beliefs just weren't true,
Yeah.
turned out to be false. This is true of all of us. It's certainly true of me now. 5 years from now, I'm going to realize things I believe now aren't true. So I've turned into much more of a mistake theorist.
Sure. And would you say that, because you're a student at Columbia, would you say that your views are unusual amongst your peers or on campus, that you are, we hear all the time about American university campuses being hotbeds of social justice activism, and then we hear about groupthink in academia, how professors all skew to the left or the hard left increasingly. Would you say that you stick out as being an odd one out in that environment?
If I'm odd, it's mostly because I am very vocal with what I think.
Yeah.
I'm as vocal as the, social justice contingent on campus. I'm not sure that my views actually mark me as that different, because, so recently on campus we had an instance of alleged racism where a kid walked through a gate where you had to show your ID. I walked through the gate 1,000 times. They asked everyone for their ID. He didn't know that, and the security followed him asking for his ID over and over again. From his perspective, he thought they were asking because he was black. They were just asking because it's their job. And this blew up on campus. And I remember the security guards in question got put on paid leave pending an investigation for their conduct, which I think was just them doing their jobs to a T. My point here is that I was vocal about pushing back against the idea that this was racism, and so many kids came up to me, left-wing kids, right, from college, saying, "Hey, I really agreed with your Facebook post or your Quillette piece," but none of them liked the posts on Facebook, right? Because it's just the reputational cost of being seen as not sufficiently cognizant of the problem of white supremacy is so high right now that we're living through an era similar to McCarthyism, in the sense that there were actual communist spies in America.
Yeah.
It was a real problem, but we blew it so far out of proportion that we no longer cared about the individual facts of individual cases, which were often exculpatory of individuals who were not in fact communists, or who were but who were not spies, right? So something very similar is happening with racism now, where there are legitimate racists and there is racism, but the threat has been so exaggerated that if you question, if you provide exculpatory evidence in any individual case, people say, well, what side are you on, right? There's this, and that's, we often look back at the era of McCarthyism and think, how could they have been so, how could they have been so irrational and so dogmatic? This is how. We're doing the same thing today.
So it sounds like you're describing the fear of white supremacy and racism as a bit of a moral panic in the US at the moment. Are you saying that's just on university campuses or in the whole country?
No, I think it's in the whole country. The university campus is just the sharpest case, but every poll from the past 5 years shows that the view that racism is a big problem in the US has been getting more and more popular at the same time that every objective indicator of racism has been going down in terms of polling people, in terms of even implicit bias has been going down. But basically ever since Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson in 2014, Google searches for systemic racism have shot up. White privilege, the amount of times the New York Times has mentioned racism has something like quintupled since 2014, and it had remained pretty flat for 20 years. It's not that racism is quintupled or that awareness of racism is quintupled. It's partly that we have social media now, so you can see a video of a black guy getting killed by a cop or getting beat by the cops in what is clearly an example of injustice. And there's something about seeing a video that is visceral in a way that reading it in the newspaper isn't. And the media has done a pretty terrible job of putting videos in context. For example, there are just as many videos of white people getting beaten by the cops, shot by the cops, names you'll never hear of if you read the New York Times, like Daniel Shaver, for example, killed with his hands up. That, if you're only paying attention to, kind of, if your diet of news is kind of default liberal, you will only hear the cherry-picked examples of these things happen to black people, and you'll come away with the idea that it is just a fact that black people experience deadly levels of discrimination in a way that whites don't. And that's just not supported by the data. But that view, perpetuated by social media, has, I think, led to a kind of moral panic.
Sure. And one of the interesting things that I've picked up from your writing is this idea that African Americans are not as progressive as some of the white liberals that speak on their behalf. So can you address this issue of there being conservative, many African Americans having conservative views or views similar to your own,
right,
and they're not as represented potentially in the media as sort of the Black Lives Matter activists?
So one thing that's important to remember is that conservative is not the same as Republican.
Yeah.
Although the Republican Party is the quote-unquote conservative party. Black people in America are more conservative than white people on average in every poll that's ever been done. If you're talking about approval of gay marriage or any social degree of religiosity, black people are on average more socially conservative. That said, 85 to 90% of black people vote for the Democratic Party every single time, because at least since the 1960s, the Democrats have been the party of civil rights. And that the value of anti-racism in the black community trumps the fact that socially, in terms of values, the Republican Party is more aligned with black people than white people. There's one very interesting poll that was done in Virginia about the Confederate statues. Obviously, for many people, they are nothing more than symbols of the South, the antebellum South, that fought to keep the institution of slavery alive. What this poll found was that 30% of black people in Virginia wanted the Confederate statues to stay up. That's like almost 1 in 3 black people, right? And why that's interesting to me is because the issue in the media was completely framed as black people en masse want these statues to come down because they're symbolic of slavery, and white people want them to stay up, except for the good-thinking white people who agree with all black people, right? Almost every issue is like that. Whether you're talking about affirmative action, or often you get polls of like 40% or sometimes more than half of black people opposing policies that are sold in the media as black people are for this categorically, which I think that's done deliberately, because once you can sell something as all black people are for this, it just becomes that much harder to subject that thing to any reasonable critique. Because you're saying all black people are wrong about? Well, no. What about the third of black people who want those statues up? There is a debate to be had, in other words. That doesn't mean that because a group of people think something, therefore it's right, obviously, but like many of these are live debates that are already happening, and one tactic is to pretend that the debate has already been had among black people. They all agree. It's just for the rest of you white people to finally get on board.
Right. And that sort of leads into the question that's been had in the US recently. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates kicked it off in a piece for The Atlantic about reparations for slavery. Do you think that's often, the idea of reparations for slavery is often promoted as one of these issues where all black people have already agreed on the issue and there's no dissent within the community?
It was amazing. I was at a panel discussion about reparations 2 or 3 weeks ago, and everyone on the panel was pro reparations except me. But they put a poll on the screen showing the degree to which different groups of people were for and against the concept. And again, it was something like 30% of black people were against it. And they put up this poll and they said, black people are overwhelmingly for it. They didn't even say overwhelmingly, they just said black people are for it. I said, really, that's how you read a 70-30 poll, is, quote, black people are just categorically for it? You know, I don't think that's not how I read that. Reparations, so reparations for slavery, an idea that just in the past 6 months has had a kind of rebirth. You know, you have Nancy Pelosi, you know, actually almost every Democratic candidate now has endorsed this bill to study reparations. And you know, it's amazing to me that in the year 2019, we're really having this conversation because, so for example, any reparations package, whether it's money or a program that goes to the descendants of slaves would benefit me. My ancestors were on Thomas Jefferson's plantation. And so you're talking about a politics that has so centered itself around historical grievance that it's now considering giving me some kind of benefit and not my white friend whose parents were meth addicts, or you know, the recent immigrant from Nigeria who drove my Uber a couple days ago and talked to me about his profit margin, you know, like the paltry amount of money he comes away with every month after dealing with all the expenses of you know, his business, and he's supporting a family, right? That guy gets nothing, but I get something because my ancestors were on Monticello. That's an idea that doesn't really survive scrutiny, but it's an idea that we're really entertaining in 2019. I think we're at the zenith of this moral panic around race, where ideas are not really getting subjected to the level of criticism they should be getting subjected to. And so, you know, even Bernie Sanders, who has a very stiff spine as a politician, was asked a few months ago about reparations, and he said, no, this is not the way we're going to do it. But a couple months later, he buckled. He said, okay, yes, I would support it if it came to my desk. It's just very hard to criticize these ideas because you're branded as a racist.
Right. And so what is your general critique of the identity politics or the Black Lives Matter movement? What is your general position on this kind of racially based activism in the United States at the moment?
Well, I think identity politics makes perfect sense in certain situations. So before 1964, 1965, you had, it really was true that all black people, at least in the South, had a shared fate around certain issues. Very few of them could vote. There were whole, public sectors that you simply could not enter if you were black. You couldn't move to where you want. You couldn't go to whatever school you wanted because you were black, and that was enshrined in law. In that context, it makes perfect sense to organize your politics around race because you are being oppressed categorically around your race. It makes perfect sense. The problem is now that, now it's 2019, and the problems that black people face are, in large measure, the problems that Americans are facing. It's no longer the case that you have problems analogous to voting in the South during Jim Crow, where it's a problem that black people are facing precisely because they're black and most or all black people are facing them. So for example, poverty. Most Americans below the poverty line are not black. Most black Americans are not below the poverty line. Yes, black Americans are disproportionately represented there, but if you're going to talk about curbing poverty, you're by definition talking about a problem that transcends race. And all of our problems are like that now. We can talk about why certain groups are disproportionately represented here, but America is what? Almost 350 million people. 40 million people are black, right? And they do not all think the same thing. They do not all have the same interests. So organizing, moreover, I would say politics is a game of coalitions. So if you're going to frame a given issue, whether it's poverty or incarceration or police reform, if you want to really solve these issues, and we're talking about issues that affect Americans of all races, choosing to frame those issues in racial terms, it's not a productive way to do politics in a democracy where ultimately politics is responsive to demand from the people, most of whom are not black. So if we really want to deal with these problems, we have to frame them in terms of colorblind principles rather than race-specific injustices.
Yep. So colorblindness, you're talking about the Martin Luther King vision of not judging people by the color of their skin and instead judging them by the content of their character. How does that fit with the contemporary notion that we need to check our own privilege, we need to be conscious of racial issues and make up for past structural oppression in our day-to-day interactions? How do you reconcile color blindness with increased racial consciousness?
Yeah, so the notion of color blindness has really come under attack in recent decades, and particularly in recent years. So for example, a few months ago, Bernie Sanders said, I think quite sensibly, something like, we really shouldn't be choosing our politicians based on their skin color. We should be choosing them based on their competence and their policies, right? To my ear, that sounds like a perfect demonstration of sanity, right? Clearly, that's true. Not only is it true, it's something that Martin Luther King said explicitly in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? That he said any program that rejects a politician because of their skin color, whether black or white, is something I don't want anything to do with. I'm paraphrasing, right? So in an earlier era, Bernie Sanders saying that, it would probably be lauded as a progressive sentiment. But in 2019, he was mocked for that.
Yeah.
He was mocked on the most popular late night show in America, Colbert. That, I think, gives you a sense of how successfully the idea of colorblindness has been smeared. Now, obviously, it's possible to take it too far, and when you're pretending to actually not be able to see color, obviously that's a bit silly, but that's not what the notion of colorblindness is. The notion of colorblindness is, upon reflection, I aspire to treat people as individuals, not as colors. It's a social commitment to seeing skin color not as non-existent, but as a trivial part of someone's identity. It's not a central part of your identity. The idea on the race-conscious side is that, well, people get treated differently because of their race, so you can't come in at the 8th inning and say, we're going to start treating people as individuals now. At least that's one critique of colorblindness among many. Doesn't really make much sense to me because the history of anti-black racism in the United States has been the history of failing to be colorblind, right? Like, being racist is synonymous with not being colorblind. So how are you going to fault like your antidote to racism is race consciousness, which entails viewing race as an important part of your identity, like that, that just seems like racism from the other from the other person's point of view.
Do you think there's a risk in increasing race consciousness in increasing white racial consciousness, and potentially that might be dangerous for black people?
Yeah, there definitely is that risk. What I can say is Richard Spencer, who is the most prominent white nationalist in America, has publicly said that he loves Black Lives Matter. He loves what they're doing. The more that they push black identity as an important factor, he feels the better chances his movement has of doing the same thing. Jared Taylor, who is another very prominent white nationalist, when you read what he writes, what's interesting to me is not how much hate there is for black people, although there is that. What's interesting to me is how much envy there is for the way that black Americans, relative to white Americans at least, unashamedly push race pride for themselves. What he wants to do is to emulate that for white people, to say, do you see how black people go around saying, I'm black and I'm proud? Let's do that ourselves. Of course, there is a historical asymmetry, which is that, historically white pride has come along with slavery and Jim Crow and lynching and whatnot, and black pride has been at least partly a reaction to that. So, but the antidote to racism in the past can't be an increased assertion of race pride today, right? That just puts you in a cycle of endless grievance where now, Asian Americans have a tougher time getting into Harvard than even white Americans because of a policy meant to uplift black people, right?
Yeah.
Like, it sets you up for a situation that one of my favorite writers, Thomas Sowell, summarized as, babies being born on the same day with a set of prepackaged grievances against one another, right? That's a circumstance we have to be trying to escape.
Yeah.
And centering our politics around historical grievances is not the way to do that.
Yeah. No, everything you're saying makes sense, but how do we account for past injustice and current structural oppression? I mean, isn't there a risk that we are minimizing the challenges faced by black people, young black people growing up? I mean, for example, there was a study in the New York Times which showed that social mobility was much less for young men who were black than it was for young women who were black. So there's got to be some, the implication was that it had to be some kind of prejudice impacting the failure of younger black men to be upwardly socially mobile. So surely there is still prejudice, there still is implicit bias and racism. How do we go about addressing those issues without dredging up past grievances and inflaming racial politics in a counterproductive way?
That's a very big question with a lot of parts. Let me say a few things. One is, if we're talking about reducing the amount of racial bias in society, there are two ways that we can try to do that. One is to tell people to stop being racially biased, which we do, and we should do, because it's good and very important to have strong norms against expressing racist sentiments. Yeah. That should be punished socially. But another way of reducing bias is to actually reduce the underlying statistical and social disparities that are really the source of those biases to begin with. So, I think as long as it's the case that the homicide disparity between blacks and whites is a factor of like 6 or 7, there's going to be a thought lingering in people's minds, black and white, by the way, not just white people, of stereotyping, right? as long as the facts on the ground are racially disparate, people will have some degree of bias whether or not they express it. So if we are committed to reducing racial bias, we have to be committed to actually reducing the reality that those biases reflect.
Okay.
That's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that, which I admit is slightly in tension with the first, is that racial gaps, statistical gaps in themselves, in outcomes, whether it's wealth, income, incarceration, are not straightforward evidence of discrimination, right? Most people don't. Most gaps, racial, ethnic, or otherwise, people lose no sleep over. For example, in the United States, white Americans of French descent earn 79 cents for every dollar earned by white Americans of Russian descent. Certain Native American tribes earn twice as much as others. Nigerians earn far more money than Jamaicans, who earn more money than Haitians, right? Disparity is actually the norm. So, it's really part of the problem with focusing on statistical disparities is that A, they're absolutely normal and not necessarily indicative of discrimination as the cause of those disparities. It can be caused by any number of things, including demographics, culture, etc. But secondly, it makes our notion of what progress is perverse, because an analogy I made before is that if you and I are driving from New York to California and you start out 500 miles ahead of me, and now we're halfway across the country, let's say I'm still 500 miles behind you. On one paradigm, I've made like 1,000 miles of progress because I'm 1,000 miles from New York. Under another paradigm, I've made no progress at all because I'm still 500 miles behind you. Obviously, that second paradigm is completely counterintuitive, doesn't make much sense. But that is, in fact, the way that we're assessing progress with race, right? Black people did start behind in this country for reasons that are too obvious to go into. So why would we expect groups with entirely different histories to catch up when everyone is making progress, right?
So how should progress be measured? Should we be looking at things like interracial marriage, other metrics? Like what variables do you think reflect progress?
Yeah, I think interracial marriage is a very good indicator of the degree to which groups are integrated, and segregation is also, residential segregation is a fairly good indicator. You can also, if you're concerned with outcomes in themselves, then you can measure test scores, you can measure income, lifetime income. You can measure any number of variables, and obviously you can measure life satisfaction, for example. The Federal Reserve just released a report, found that Black people at every education level are more likely than white people to say that they are doing better than their parents were, which is interesting, right? That's a fact that you wouldn't necessarily guess based on the selective portrayal in the media of Black people as economically stagnant, deprived, etc. So it's a very tricky question how to measure well-being, of course. Happiness, it's not something you can just put in a beaker, but that's my attempt at a response.
Sure. So what are some of the issues that are relevant to racial injustice that you think there should be more attention on? So we've already talked about how you think there's too much attention focused on just disparities in outcomes, but there must be some issues where race plays a role which you think more attention should be paid.
I guess So another thing the Federal Reserve report found was that the biggest gap in life satisfaction between black people and white people was not housing prices or housing value or education quality. The biggest gap was the level of perceived safety in the community where you live. Mm-hmm. Black people perceive accurately, on average, that their communities are far less safe. Here's a problem, though. The moment you start talking about safety or, quote, law and order, you will be accused of trafficking in the stereotype that black people are criminals, trafficking in racist tropes, dog whistling to conservative whites. The problem is, every poll suggests that black people are more likely to care about crime, reducing crime, that is, than white people are, because it's a you could almost frame it as a civil rights issue if you wanted to.
Yeah.
So I mean that's something that certainly has to be part of the conversation, and something that people are very hesitant to speak publicly about, because the moment you say, for example, that 52% of the homicide victims in America in 2017 were black, you also have to say that 52% of the homicide perpetrators were black.
Okay.
And black people make up 14% of the population, right? So it's a problem that is disproportionately perpetrated and suffered by black people. And to talk about that publicly opens you up to many accusations that politicians certainly don't want to be on the receiving end of, and normal people don't want to be on the receiving end of.
Yeah.
Only masochists like myself.
So how do you talk about, another issue is fatherlessness, and single motherhood is more prevalent in black communities. How do you talk about that issue and something like crime without feeding into negative stereotypes and without providing ammunition to white supremacists? How do you tread that very delicate line?
Well, I'm not sure it is so delicate. White supremacy is absolutely horrible. Is it really the case, that the threat of white supremacy is so ever present that we can't talk about what is the leading cause of death for young black men in the United States, which is homicide? I don't think that should necessarily be the case. I think it's possible to have a nuanced conversation about these things. In terms of fatherlessness, one thing that is useful to point out, and probably white supremacists would not like this fact, is that the rate of fatherless homes was pretty similar in black and white communities as late as the 1950s. It was really only in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that it ballooned out of control to the point where now some 2/3 or more of black kids are born to homes, born out of wedlock. But one interesting finding from actually the report you brought up a few minutes ago was that not having a father in the home by itself is not correlated with bad outcomes, but being from a community where there's high levels of fatherlessness, whether or not you are in a fatherless home, is very highly correlated with having bad outcomes. There are neighborhoods in the United States where 90% of homes do not have fathers. That, to me, the problem with this is, this can seem finger wagging, like, oh, I'm telling men to just father their kids. Why aren't you doing better, right? That's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to point out is that fatherlessness at that scale is, if not a cause of significant dysfunction, it's certainly a consequence of, it's an indicator of dysfunction, a huge indicator of dysfunction. And again, this is an issue that, if talked about in the wrong way, can just seem like you are bashing black people or blaming the victim. But I don't see blame as really a relevant concept to this discussion. No one, in a deep sense, is ultimately to blame for where they were born, the ideas and values that were drummed into their head on mother's knee, none of us can really claim to be the authors of ourselves. And that undermines both blame and pride, in my view. And from the point of view of just making, increasing human flourishing, we have to be able to talk about problems that are caused by humans without feeling that we are blaming people.
Yep. Great. Well, I think we are opening up to audience questions at the moment. Yep. Thank you. Let's have a look. All right. So you spoke about the need for more nuanced conversations. Why aren't we having those now, and how do we bring it about?
Well, I guess we are having it right now, literally right now. But I take your point that if you're generally watching the news or reading the papers, yeah, there is definitely. I think part of the lack of nuance is probably attributable to the ad-based model of journalism that incentivizes clickbait. In order to survive, news outlets are having to eschew nuance in favor of, essentially clickbait, anything that will go viral. And unfortunately, what goes viral is not correlated with what is a deep and important insight on a given topic. So the incentives are aligned in the wrong way for having these conversations.
Another question. Have you experienced racism?
Sure. I wrote about this in the Columbia newspaper. I was in the writing center at college and waiting for my professor to have a meeting. And I was dressed in kind of like a plain white tee and some kind of ratty jeans. And this guy came up to me and asked me if I was here to see someone. And I said, yes, my professor, he's right there. The guy didn't believe me. He went to confirm with my professor that I was in fact a student, subjected me to all kinds of scrutiny that he subjected no one else to. The plausible explanation is that he did that. A mix of, probably mostly because I was black and perhaps because of what I was wearing. Those things happen. They happen, they happen all the time. They happen far less than they used to. They happen much more in certain areas of the country than others. However, one thing that happens is there's a kind of plane crash effect where every time a plane crashes, no matter where it is in the world, it's on the front pages of newspapers the next day, which gives people the sense that flying is far more dangerous than it is. In fact, it's much safer than driving, much safer than walking across the street. And yet we feel no fear of walking across the street. Something similar happens with racism where, if what happened last year, two black guys in a Starbucks, get the police called on them, that's all we're talking about for 2 weeks. So it gives you, what James Baldwin wrote, it can give you a sense of paranoia about experiences of racism that is out of proportion with the likelihood of those things actually happening.
Sure. Another question. Do you think inequality is part of the human condition, or do you think it's something we should actively work against or just accept, both in terms of policy and our relationships?
Well, that's a good question. Yes, I think inequality is a part of the human condition, which is to say inequality of outcomes. There has not been a single multi-ethnic society on Earth, whether or not those ethnicities were all of the same race or not, where ethnic groups have achieved very similar or identical outcomes. I urge you all to go to Wikipedia and just look at the difference between white Americans of French descent, Russian descent, Swedish descent. disparity is the norm, not the exception. If you're going to talk about something like income inequality, I am in favor of a welfare state that is well structured and smart but compassionate. At the same time, mere measures of income inequality tell you very, very little about the degree to which people on the bottom of society are actually striving. Like Pakistan and Yemen have more income equality than the United States. And yet Pakistanis and Yemenis, in many cases, are doing everything they can to get here and not the reverse, which should tell you something about how shallow mere measures of inequality are. There's another famous example of when Ghana and the Ivory Coast were liberated from British and French rule, respectively. The leaders of both countries made a bet about which one would be thriving more in 10 or 20 years. One country tried socialist policies, one tried capitalist policies. Obviously, as happens everywhere the experiment has been tried, the capitalist country ended up having a higher standard of living for the rich and the poor, but more income inequality because the rich were super rich. Of course, it was better to be poor in the Ivory Coast than in Ghana, even under higher levels of income inequality. Sure. So I think that's the wrong focus.
Sure. All right, so one more question. Oh, we've got time for a few more. What do you think is driving the white liberal progressives who both represent and receive messages of a homogenous black position and who do not account for the diversity in the black community? Is this just self-serving virtue signaling?
I'm hesitant to just accuse people of virtue signaling because it's not very charitable. I tend to assume people believe what they say they believe unless I'm really conclusively demonstrated or persuaded that it's not the case. Also, I think, like from an evolutionary psychology perspective, we're all kind of programmed to virtue signal kind of all the time, if you really think about it deeply. But that aside, what's driving what has been called the Great Awakening of the past 5 years? I think it is in large measure due to social media and the effect of the echo chamber effects of social media, getting all your news from getting the most inflammatory things promoted in your news feeds. When those inflammatory things are videos of black people getting killed by the cops, as I mentioned earlier, I think that has been the primary driver of the Great Awakening.
Mm-hmm. And what do you make of the rise in race hate crime hoaxes? For example, the Jussie Smollett case. So for people who aren't familiar with the Jussie Smollett case, there was an actor, what was the show? Empire.
Empire, yeah.
And he fabricated a hate crime hoax where he was, perhaps you remember the details better than I do.
Yeah, he fabricated, he paid two of his friends to pour bleach on him and throw a noose around his neck in order to essentially be the noble victim in the Trump era, and lied about it. Said that the people who did it to him were wearing MAGA hats. And he had also he had written a fake hate letter to himself a few weeks earlier, which hadn't gotten enough press, so I think that's why he did the full-blown hoax. I think part of the motivation for this is it's a little bit like Munchausen syndrome, where there's a kind of bug in human psychology where it can feel really good to be like taken care of and to be a victim. So, Munchausen syndrome usually tends to be women check themselves into the hospital or get themselves sick in order to be cared for. It's a very small percentage of people that do this, but nurses are trained to identify this because when you're talking about a full hospital, it happens often enough. And there's Munchausen's by proxy, where people get their own baby sick so that their baby can be taken care of. It's a weird bug of human psychology, but I think it actually, Munchausen's is just the extreme case of a general phenomenon, which is that it can kind of feel good to be the victim. And that bug of human psychology, I think, has been amplified and exacerbated by a culture of victimhood, which says your opinions are more valid if you've been through something bad. If you've experienced racism, that gives you the right to speak about it more than someone who hasn't. It's also a huge shortcut. If you want to be someone who is taken seriously in public, whose ideas provoke oohs and ahs from the crowd, one way of doing that is to become very competent at the subject matter. Another way of doing that is to become a victim. I think Jussie Smollett is kind of the encapsulation of a cultural moment where we have promoted victimhood. We've elevated victimhood to a virtue.
Interesting. So that leads into the next question, which is, what are your feelings about microaggressions, the concept that persistent subjection to small daily injustices and race or sex-based discrimination can affect the psychology or the psychological and societal success of individuals?
I've still yet to see the evidence that it really affects the outcomes of individuals. I mean, my God. Yes, there are daily, microaggressions are real in the sense that, when I was a kid in middle school and I had an afro, and sometimes white people hadn't really grown up around people with afros, they would come up and touch it, right? And I hated that. It absolutely drove me crazy, right? That's a microaggression, okay? But is it really a microaggression? Aggressions are, by definition, intentional. Microaggressions are not.
Yeah.
We are defining up faux pas. We already have a word for that. It's called a faux pas. If you frame it as a microaggression, it actually becomes, from the position of the microaggressed upon, something bigger than it needs to be. If you amplify a faux pas with an ideology, it can actually hurt more. Yeah. Because you interpret it as evidence of a society hostile towards you, which I think is very unhealthy.
Yeah. Are you going to run for political office? I'd vote for you if I could. You'd have to be in America, but is that something you've entertained?
No, it's not. People always ask me that, and I for the life of me cannot. I don't know what it is. What is it about me that suggests that? Maybe I wear a suit and I speak in full sentences, but
perhaps people see
which some of our presidents
qualities.
can't manage to do, by the way, with the full sentences. But no, I don't. I mean, the problem with politicians is that, you almost by definition, you either have to, like Donald Trump, really have no strong beliefs so that you're willing to say whatever is opportune in the moment, or you have to be someone who's willing to say things they don't believe, because it's really hard to do well as a politician and strictly say the things you believe to be true at a deep level.
Yeah.
And that's a cost I don't think I could
Sure.
bear.
Now, we have to wrap up, but you are very young. Are you able to share with the audience how old you are?
23.
Wow, 23. And do you have any plans do you have any idea of where you're going to go?
I plan to go back to New York in a few days.
No, with your
that.
intellectual career. And Coleman, we should mention, he's a successful musician. He's also played in the backup band for Rihanna, the MTV Music Awards. So do you see an intellectual life or a musical life as the path you want to take?
Hopefully a bit of both.
Yeah.
I would like to, working on writing, working on a book at the moment, and, perhaps podcasting. But I love music so much, and it's one of the things I do for which I get no hate. So
Great.
which is very nice. So I'd like to do a little bit of it,
Okay,
a little bit of everything.
fabulous.
Yeah.
Can you all put your hands together for Coleman? All right, that's it.
Okay.
Cool.
Hi, everybody. Lunch is included today, so I'm going to give what hopefully will be very clear instructions.